Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Bga Candid Conversation. This is the latest in our series of discussions with prominent public officials on a wide range of good government topics, and we'll probably throw in a little politics so it's more fun. I'm Andy Shaw, President and CEO of the Better Government Association, which, as many of you know, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, full-service watchdog organization that shines a light on government and holds public officials accountable. Our guest today is the Treasurer of the City of Chicago, Kurt Summers. He was appointed Treasurer in 2014 by Mayor Emanuel, won on his own in 2015, runs an office that is responsible for $30 billion plus in city and pension fund money. He has to manage that money and invest it wisely. The office also manages programs that are designed to spur economic development in Chicago neighborhoods. I like to describe this as an extraordinarily important office that no one knows anything about. It's virtually invisible, and the main reason is it has too many dollar signs and too many zeros in front of it, and that glazes people's eyes over. But I think maybe we can put a little human face on the office today, Kurt, which is probably a good thing because of its importance. Let me say that I really enjoyed going over Kurt's bio because he is one of the more interesting characters in a public sector job these days. He comes from a broken family in the truest sense of the word. He was raised at one time or another by a mother, a father, a stepfather, a grandmother, a grandfather, even a couple of aunts in a variety of places, including a period of time when he had to dodge bullets and gangbangers in the shadows of the infamous Robert Taylor homes on the city's south side. He could have folded up his tent and let that deter him into a life of dysfunction, but I think he went in slightly the opposite direction. He graduated from one of the city's preeminent high schools, Whitney Young, went on to Washington University in St. Louis, got an MBA at, I can't remember the name of it, it's a famous college, Harvard University in Cambridge, Mass. And he had a few interesting jobs along the way, too. It wasn't enough just to get the Harvard MBA. He was chief of staff to the Olympic bid, the city's bid in 2012, chief of staff to Pat Ryan. He describes the city's failure to get the Olympics as his most serious professional disappointment. He was also chief of staff to Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. And in terms of private sector experience, he worked for Pat Ryan when Pat Ryan started what is now a very large insurance brokerage business after leaving Aon, and he also worked as an executive for Grosvenor Capital Management run by Michael Sachs, who happens to be one of Mayor Emanuel's closest friends, confidants, and financial supporters. It's a pretty elaborate resume. How do you go from the shadows of the Robert Taylor homes to the glitter of Grosvenor?
God's grace, honestly. I had a hedge of protection around me. I had great extended family members that looked out for me. And truly, but for a good amount of luck and family intervention and God's grace, I'd be like other friends who grew up on the same block who ended up in jail or died or had children at a young age and got off the path. I was just very fortunate.
And because of your background and your unique perspective, I thought we would divide this into like three segments. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of your personal narrative on your views of problems in the city of Chicago. Secondarily, we'll go into Wonkville for a little while and talk about the treasurer's office and all those dollar signs and zeros, the ones that are important. And then at the end, we have to talk a little politics, because I think I read something in the Sun-Times a couple of weeks ago about how you were not ruling out a run for governor. I'm thinking, the guy's only 37. I mean, he wants to, what about president? Anyway, so there's lots of fun things to talk about, but I think the narrative is the right place to start, because you said a couple of things in magazine articles that I found really fascinating. You said Chicago doesn't have a violence problem, it has an economics problem. And you explained it in the article, so please share it with our audience as we're live streaming and in person at the Union League Club.
I think it's this simple. I say it everywhere I go, and I say it whether I'm talking to a community group or to, just this morning, a group of the most sophisticated investors in the world who are in town for an event. The people in Chicago are not inherently predisposed or genetically predisposed to commit violent crimes. We're not more violent than people in any other city in this country naturally.
Despite the numbing statistics.
Yeah, that's right. This issue isn't one of nature, it's one of nurture. It's a result of a lack of economic opportunity. The way I think about it is, it's like we have a sickness and we want to treat the symptom but not attack and cure the thing that is making us sick. The lack of economic opportunity, the growth of despair and lack of hope leads to these set of options and bad choices. And I've said publicly, and I really mean that, no amount of additional police or detectives or policing strategies is going to change the economic conditions, especially for the people in the south and west sides of the city. And until you do that, you're not curing the problem.
Okay, so is the mayor making a mistake when he talks about 1,000 more cops? That's enormously expensive. We're paying with our tax dollars. Should he be using the money to spur economic development instead if cops aren't the answer?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, and you need both. And the mayor has an incredible challenge here, which is addressing and reforming a policing strategy that has existed for half of a century, and the way that we think about our resources. At the same time, a big part of the reason why we're excited about what's going to happen in the next 30 days of a local investment fund, which I know we'll talk about, is he recognizes, and I've been pushing for 23 months now since day one, that you have to have a strategy to invest locally. And it's almost impossible when you spend 40% of your budget on an annual basis. We spend $4 billion a year on criminal justice and policing. It's almost impossible overnight to turn the tide when your fiscal priorities have been there for 5 decades.
But let me ask you, so we obviously have to install accountability in the police department and the code of silence, the cover-ups, the enabling, and repair the relationships with communities. The communities have to do their part too. They have to appreciate the value of police officers. But would that be a more important task than simply putting 1,000 more blue uniforms out there? Or do you think that the move to add that many new police officers is also part of the solution?
Yeah, I think we don't have the luxury to have tunnel vision here. We don't have the luxury to say it's one solution. This is a systemic issue that borders race, it borders poverty, and systemic issues that we've had since the creation of this country, let alone this state or the city. And it won't be addressed in a single lane. We do need that. Look at the detectives alone. The clearance rate in Chicago is amongst the worst in the country, and it's especially the worst in black and brown neighborhoods. You don't clear unsolved crimes, violent crimes, without two things: more detectives doing the work and more community participation. Got to have those things. Now, if you don't want those things to occur again, you have to create economic opportunities for the people who only see this as an option.
Can the mayor restore both his credibility and his stature in communities that have been so angered by his handling of the McDonald case?
I think it's early still to tell that. He's a little over a year into his second term, and it's up to the mayor and the way that he navigates it, and ultimately up to the people of Chicago to see whether or not their lives are better after than before, whether there's true transparency and accountability. And there's clearly a credibility gap that exists today, and I know that it's something that he's fiercely working on, and I think everyone wants to have strong leadership in this city, and it's in all of our interests for that to be the case.
In another one of the interviews that I read, one of the things you said that I found most depressing was the fact that here you're approaching 40 years old and you haven't seen these communities that you began in change at all. In other words, you basically reflect on a south side and a west side that has not really gotten much better from the time you were born. It's 4 decades, and either a combination of the people themselves and the government and whatever the forces are that either improve or deteriorate communities, all the factors and the forces and the sadness is still there.
In some respects, it's even gotten worse. I mean, one of the first interviews I did when I started this path was with Laura Washington. And I said, Laura, I want you to come to the neighborhood I grew up in. And I'll do this interview if you walk around the streets with me. And I want you to see the poverty. I want you to see the despair. I want you to see the empty lots. I want you to see the people doing and dealing drugs out in the public, in plain sight, in the middle of the day. And I want to show you the places that I was shot at. I want to show you the same empty lots that existed, the same place that had needles on the ground when I grew up. Not only do you see that now, but in some cases, you've seen further deterioration. In Chatham, where I'd spend summers with my grandmother and growing up, and my family lived for 50 years, we used to have to travel for 2 miles, 3 miles to get to a grocery store. We had the food basket on 87th Street. Doesn't exist anymore. Going to the local library, which hadn't had a renovation in 30 years until this year, was a luxury and a fun thing to do. It hasn't been for the last 3 decades.
And the guns didn't fire off 50 rounds in 10 seconds.
That's right. It was a different time from that perspective.
Okay, so I mean, look, you're a positive guy. You don't play the blame game, but where does the blame lie? Obviously, some of it lies in communities that have not taken care of their own business, but a lot of it must be the vestiges of slavery and racism. You've talked about that before. Did the city fail to solve the problem? Did the state fail? Did the federal government? I mean, has it been a collective failure?
We've all failed. Literally, we've all failed. Every actor, every stakeholder, including members of the community, have failed. Whether it's waiting for someone else to solve the problem, not addressing issues in your own family. Certainly, there's some personal accountability there, but we have to address the issues of segregation, racism, and poverty in our country, and how they've been institutionalized in our school system. They've been institutionalized in housing, and you know, there was a stat that I learned just 2 days ago that blew my mind. There was a professor I had while I was in business school who started a talk. We were in D.C. with all the leading financial minds for local governments around the country, and he started the talk saying, I want to tell you about a time that I profited off of racism. And what he began to say was, in the municipal bond market, what we all require to fund schools and hospitals and our public services, roads, in the municipal bond market, in populations that had greater African American, greater Hispanic, greater minority populations, all other things being equal, those populations were required to pay a premium to issue their bonds. Their bonds were discounted relative to others, and he used countless examples.
For no good reason.
For no market reason.
I see.
For no market reason. The reason is very clear. We just have to be clear about it and honest about it. And so everything from the way the market interprets a Chicago public school system that's 85% minority and poor, and what it costs them to issue bonds, all the way to how does a specific administrator decide what the housing strategy is going to be for affordable housing, and do you let developers just pay it off so they don't have to mix incomes and races in their buildings? These decisions are all connected, and they've been existing since the inception of this country, and they certainly have existed for the last century in Chicago.
You're going to have lots of opportunities to tackle those problems, I think, along the way when you move to other jobs, and you do have opportunities in the Treasurer's office. We'll talk about those in a moment. One last question on culpability. As the Obama two-term administration winds down, are you, like many, disappointed in his inability to do more about the problems we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes?
What I've been disappointed in is just how recalcitrant the other stakeholders have been. We have a cottage industry in DC, much like Springfield, that doesn't have an interest in changing the status quo. They live, breathe, and make a livelihood and a pretty good living off of things being the way that they are. In fact, I experienced this in Springfield. We introduced a bill earlier this year that was meant to protect small business owners from online predatory lending, right? Because there is no standard. There hasn't been a standard that exists, so people can charge whatever they want. They don't have to disclose the fees, and they end up bankrupting these companies. I now call that the Lobbyist Employment Act of 2016. 18 lobbyists were employed in about 24 hours to try and kill the bill. And that's when there's something positive going on, right? So this happens in Springfield, this happens in DC. I think the president has done a phenomenal job in addressing and trying to tackle some of the toughest issues that we have around race, around immigration, around marriage equality, and doing it not just with his words, where he's a great orator and leader, but with his actions. And when he's been blocked by the Congress, he's tried to find every other way as a constitutional law professor that is afforded to him in the Constitution to get there.
Okay, so from the vast power and influence of the White House to the more mundane tasks of the Treasurer's office. I was amazed to find that you've been able to do an awful lot of activist things in a couple of years, which almost seem like no-brainers, but you had to do them, others hadn't. You pool the cost of your investment counseling firms or investment advisors, and you've been able to reduce the cost of that, I read, $50 million a year. It'll be $1 billion over the life of some of these funds. Is that right?
That's the potential for it. We've gotten 8 of the 11 funds to sign on. Hopefully, if the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund and Cook County are listening, they'll join shortly. And what we see is an ability to save $25 to $50 million a year. That's $1 to $2 billion over the life of these plans. And we've already seen several $1 million of savings without even having everyone.
And you're also making money with wiser investments, it sounds like. And in addition, not just pooling, you're forcing banks to disclose information about where they're lending so that you can make sure that you hold them accountable for non-investments in parts of the city where you think it's a very activist approach to investment strategy, and more disclosure, more requirements. I guess the idea is to leverage all these dollars in ways that will benefit communities.
Look, the way I view it is it's their money, right? If you live in Chicago, this is your money, and it should benefit you. It should be leveraged to benefit you. And if we have partners like banks who aren't willing to disclose whether or not they invest in our communities, then they're not willing to be good partners to you, and maybe they're not deserving of your money. And if they're not doing enough, then that's up to us to decide, and me as your advocate. It's the same thing with leveraging this portfolio. Most people, to your point about getting the zeros and the dollars behind this year alone, we're going to generate over $100 million from the portfolio, doubling a record year from last year in the lowest interest rate environment in history. We're doubling the revenues. That's $50 million more in the pockets of the people of Chicago. Less money that we would have to get from you in taxes, more money to services, to streets, roads, cops, everything else that you require from your government. We've missed out on $500 million of that in the last decade because we haven't been doing this. And so I don't view it as, this is some insanely activist approach. My view is I'm empowering the capital that the people provide me with to serve them.
And you have a pretty big plan in that regard that you want to use for really major economic development in communities. You want to, I think you've asked the council to consider an ordinance that would empower you to really put a lot of those dollars under your stewardship into investments in communities. Not like a TIF where you just give the money, you give somebody a tax break. You'd basically be investing in startups or relocation businesses. How would that work?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, and I'll tell you how we got to this point. When you look at the capital that we invest, we have over $35 billion in local pension assets, another $6 or $7 billion in my office in Treasury, maybe $3-4 billion in Treasury assets elsewhere. $45-50 billion that's invested on a daily basis. It's invested with a mandate in South America, in East Asia, in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Western Europe.
As you say, you invest everywhere but here.
Everywhere but our backyard. And by the way, guys, we're the third largest market and the largest economy in the world. Our economy is larger than Argentina. It's the size of Nigeria. Chicago's. It's the size of Nigeria. It's larger than Argentina. But we have strategies to invest in those other places. And we're afraid to invest here because of the headline risk. We're afraid to invest here because of political risk. We invest in Greece or Turkey, and they have a coup, and we lose all our money. No one loses their job. If you invest down the street and the person who is the lawyer for that real estate deal is the cousin of an alderman, your job's at risk. Meanwhile, communities suffer and they lose. And so I'm talking about taking a very small portion of that, 100 million of the 50 billion that we have invested, 100 million of the 6 billion in my office, and seeding that to attract other capital from the private sector to invest in Chicago.
It's like private equity. In other words, it's almost like, you know, you raise the money to buy a company in effect.
Exactly right. But now we're raising the money to invest in companies and to invest in them where very clearly there has been a systemic gap, whether it's because of race or ethnicity or poverty, whatever the issue is. When you look at communities in this city, equally performing high return opportunities don't have access to capital. Most of them are minority and women-owned businesses or projects in neighborhoods where you see a large minority population. Those projects don't get funded, or the cost of them is
well, can't you lean
prohibitive.
on the banks sufficiently since you control where your revenue sits and grows? Can't you just make the banks do this if they want your cash in their tills?
The answer is, that's why we passed the Municipal Depositories Ordinance. Yes, the banks should, the pension fund should, we should, the corporation should. The philanthropic community is already getting out there with Benefit Chicago. They should. We all have to step up. There's $4 billion a year that's invested in policing and crime, and a fraction of that, 10 to 20% of that, in economic development. And that's a 50-year cumulative impact that we're seeing in priorities.
Is this a failure of leadership?
And.
Is it a failure of leadership across the board? That's how I say. You know, you don't get a dysfunctional state and a deeply troubled city and school system if there hasn't been like decades of failed leadership in one way or another.
It's hard. So what's happened is the city of Chicago, if you think about it, in the last 50 years has lost 1 million people, in their population. It's because slowly and surely the value proposition, particularly for the working class, has eroded, and the ability to live affordably and pay and work here for poorer people has dried up. So the people that have left here largely have been the backbone, the working class folks and middle class folks and working class people. So what's happened is it didn't happen overnight. It's eroded, and it's easy to see tall buildings grow up downtown, have a great skyline, have corporate relocations. We were talking about some of those earlier.
But that's only a few jobs each.
But how many jobs are really there? It's a great story. It's exciting. It gets good press. But underneath it all, the fundamentals and the value proposition for average everyday Chicagoans has been declining.
Two more wonk questions. You have aggressively argued to sue some of the banks that participated in what we call toxic swaps. That those are these bond deals in which we tried to make a little money off the deal or cut our rates, which would be good if it worked, but it's like a Vegas gamble. You roll the dice, and if the interest rates go the opposite way, you end up with a huge bill. I think I calculated the city having lost or paid back close to $1 billion on those deals, and now Rauner's dealing with a couple $100 million. I know you were downstate trying to give them some guidance. We've worked hard on that issue up here in Chicago. But the mayor didn't listen to you, and it doesn't look like the governor's listening. I mean, your point is there was collusion, and these banks basically, I mean, I wonder why the U.S. attorney isn't indicting anybody if people willfully kind of rigged markets to cost taxpayers money on their investments.
So I think a couple things. First of all, I think the DOJ should look at this, and I do think that this could be not just civil but criminal activity. You're talking about anti-competitive behavior. It's worse than you're gambling and the house is winning. The house is determining and changing the rate every day. It's not you're making a bet of whether or not interest rates are going to go up or down. You have no transparency. There were 17 banks that controlled 80% of the market, and they closed out anyone else who wanted to be in the market, right? So if the market was poised to move against them, they could control that. And no one would know.
It sounds like antitrust.
That's exactly right. So we've made an antitrust claim, and while the city has not joined the claim, the Corporation Council has said to us that if a class was seated, then we would be a part of that class.
Some cities have gone that route.
City of Philadelphia
some of them have
has.
settled with. Some of them have gotten decent returns from banks that they threatened or sued.
Yeah, in other actions, you've seen, settlements as high as $4.5 billion to a class, and so what we will see is, as this evolves, the police pension fund is a part of it. The Chicago Teachers Pension Fund is a part of it. We'll see what happens, and we'll continue to call on others to join the suit.
What do you hear from the Rauner administration, which is facing a similar situation, a much lower level?
Yeah, I think.
And these are all the people that the governor did business with over the years in private equity. I'm not suggesting that. I mean, you would have too in your businesses. Well,
look, all of us have. If you have a mortgage, you've done business with someone who's participated in this. The reality is, when I look at the state of Illinois, they recently renegotiated a number of their swaps. I think that was smart and not enough. I don't know why the governor won't take the step, knowing that there's the exposure there, understanding that this was collusive and anti-competitive behavior to join in. And I think as a result of that, the only people that suffer are the taxpayers.
But you're saying the city will get involved if they have a place in the class.
Right, and the state hasn't even said that.
And speaking of the governor, who comes out of the financial world, as do you, you've been quoted as saying that you don't think there's much economic incentive for the turnaround agenda. You've basically said that with the exception of workers' comp, where you do see some tangible savings from reforms, that the rest of it is almost like hooey. In other words, it's just not economically justified.
Yeah, it's ideology. Saying that Illinois has to be a right-to-work state has marginal impact on the average everyday resident here and taxpayer. And some of these reform, pushing for term limits, and that becomes a political agenda, that becomes ideology. And I think what gets lost is, we are in one of the worst, we are the laughing stock of the country in the state of Illinois. We have the highest pension debt. We don't pay our bills. We're having to pay hedge funds, truly. We are paying, state of Illinois today, paying hedge funds to pay our bills for us and take an IOU.
And former Governor Edgar's involved in one of those.
And we're paying them 12 to 14% interest rates on that. It's ridiculous. And we're asking our vendors to take a 10% discount. We're not even paying them the full amount.
And you think workers' comp is the only one of the turnaround items that actually has tangible saving potential, not lawsuit reform?
I wouldn't. So I think tort reform is part of workers' comp. So I would I would couple them. You can't have, the kind of material workers' comp reform that the governor proposes without, looking at the way these things are litigated. So you have to look at both of them, but that's the one that's material. It's not, we're not reforming our delivery of services. We're not being more innovative. We're not truly addressing our balance sheet issues at all through any of that. So I think it's irresponsible, frankly, to focus just on these ideological issues and not on the real issues that are hurting our economy.
And so, in fairness, what do you make of the oft-repeated comment by Speaker Madigan that his is a fight to protect the middle class from Rauner? I try to figure out if you cut costs for a bulk of taxpayers, isn't that a good thing? I mean, that's what Rauner would argue, that if you lower some of the union costs at the local level, that will lower the burden on the local taxpayers. And so they're middle class too. So is that jargon also, or is that a legitimate fight, do you think?
This is classic, do you believe in trickle-down economics or not, right? So saying that you want to lower the wages and standards and working rights of union employees so that there's more money for companies to reinvest the profits. This is Reaganomics. This is trickle-down economics. And fundamentally, as the treasurer of the city of Chicago, I'm looking at 77 neighborhoods and saying, how does this lead to more resources to them? And I don't see it. The reason why we had to create this local investment fund and this Fund 77 is because the capital isn't flowing in a free market economy. It's not happening. Without workers' protections, the middle class is not protected.
And so Madigan's, you think that's a legitimate point, that's part of his fight?
Yeah, I think that the speaker has a number of things that he's fighting for, right? And he's not devoid of a political agenda either. But if I have the choice of saying trickle-down economics or protecting middle-class workers that we've seen since the suffrage movement to be needed in the place like Chicago that is the birthplace of the modern labor movement, I'm going to go on the side of that every time.
Lockbox amendment for transportation funding, good or bad? That's the one people are voting on now. Protect the transportation and road fund dollars, regardless of what other things might be demanding them. Is that a good constitutional amendment, or do you agree with some, including the BGA, that it's a special interest amendment? The goal is good, to get the road fund spent, but these should be decisions made by lawmakers in Springfield, and you shouldn't have every special interest with an amendment. Otherwise, we should have had one for full school funding, or full health care, or full whatever.
So I don't think that I think we have to be careful about the impact of special interests and their sort of profit agenda. This is, a cottage industry again that supports that in Illinois. They've been there. You see them around things like the toll authority and other places. They've been there. They're going to be there. As I did a fellowship in government once. 2 years out of school, and the folks who were civil service employees there basically said, we were here before you got here, we're going to be here after you leave. And
so will the roads.
And so will the roads, and so will those folks. I think that I tend to agree with you that the intent is positive, and we sorely need to invest in infrastructure. If I can just give you one point back to this professor who I learned a lot from a couple days ago. One of the interesting bodies of work that's happened around the country is to show that the U.S. increasingly has less economic mobility. So if you were born poor, you were less likely to get out of that being in the U.S. versus other developed countries, and you're especially less likely getting out of that if you're a person of color or a woman. And the two biggest determinants of that are investment in infrastructure, two types of infrastructure. One is schools and education. The other is roads. And here's what's interesting. The more advanced, the better the road, the more investment there are in the roads, the less commute time that you have, the more time and the less commute time that your children have, and the more time that you spend together. It's been a great body of work to show that this variable has as big of an impact on the economic mobility of poor people in this country as the quality of their education.
Well, when we're done, you're going to have to tell me who that is so I can read up on that. And
Yeah.
I would have guessed mass transit, but that's interesting.
Yeah.
One more wonk question, then a little political fun.
Yeah.
You are now the head of the mayor's infrastructure trust, which has been around. I don't know if it's 2 years now, but I think it's probably fair to say it's been one of the more underperforming new entities because it's done almost nothing. You now head it, and you told me as we were getting ready to start that you have something you're about to announce that's extraordinarily exciting.
It is.
I mean, it's not. I mean, it's not. Living with the Kardashians, but it's pretty interesting.
I'm not going to get a million new Twitter followers as a result of this. So look, I'm kind of a glutton for punishment. We keep talking about these turnaround situations you go into. I love it because it's just nothing but opportunities. And I think the Chicago Infrastructure Trust was one of those. It was announced with great fanfare 4 years ago. President Clinton was here. It was meant to be a model for urban investment in infrastructure and public-private partnerships. And I believe that in a Clinton administration, should she win shortly, her focus on an infrastructure-based bank will look a lot like this. A year ago, the mayor asked me to become the chair. He was revamping the entire entity, new staff, new board, et cetera, and just under a year ago. And earlier this year, a couple months ago, we announced that we are going to begin, we're going to select the firms to begin the largest lighting project in North America.
You're going to relight the whole city.
Effectively, we're going to recreate the entire lighting grid with LED efficient lights, with smart pole technology. So these things will be able to talk to each other. They'll be able to give us data. They'll be able to help with public safety. If there's an incident somewhere, you can increase the lights there if you're looking for an offender. If someone calls 911, you can turn that light in front of that house a different color. It's really fascinating what you can do with the technology now. But we have more lights per capita than any other city in North America. And we're not very energy efficient. Only about 15%.
Can we take over from Paris, City of Lights, after this?
But it's really fascinating. This is a several $100 million project.
With ComEd?
Well, so ComEd is, obviously they are the utility provider, but they are also one of the folks who are bidding to do the work.
Oh, okay.
So they're a short list of groups who will do it. We'll announce it likely in January, and this will be the first of its kind in the country, in North America.
Yeah, I think as we approach the end of this conversation, I think the audience and the folks watching and those who will watch the tape of this later will be amazed at the number of things. I mean, I am amazed at the number of things you can actually do proactively to hopefully improve the quality of life in the city from what's viewed as kind of just a numbers crunching office. And so that's cool. And as a result of your unique background, one thing I forgot to say at the beginning, I don't know if I forgot or maybe I saved it to the end because it's sort of fun, is that Kurt's grandfather was Sam Patch, who was the late Mayor Harold Washington's top political advisor and friend and confidant. And in one of Kurt's interviews with a magazine, he talked about how he basically spent a lot of his formative years kind of listening to Harold and Sam talk about strategic things for the city of Chicago. And I say that because that's the political pedigree that you bring to this. I mean, I don't know how many years you were in that environment as you moved around among relatives and things, but enough for it to have been very formative. Don't you call Sam Patch the most significant of the caretakers for the formulation of who you are?
Yeah, I mean, he was the patriarch of our family. We lost him 11 years ago, and certainly the person who, when I was young and dealing with the issues that you deal with in that neighborhood, the person more than anyone else that really looked out for me and my future. And when my parents divorced, I went to live with his two sisters right above him on 47th in Michigan, and that was right in the midst of the Washington administration, the first term, and just seeing that and being a part of it, and those weekend conversations downstairs, and these guys loved politics, and they loved sort of the sport of it and the strategy of it, but most importantly, they loved people, and they loved being around people and serving people and thinking about ways in which people are being underserved and what they were going to do about it.
Yeah, and I knew Sam. I covered him when I was an ABC political reporter. Of course, covered Harold during his 2 terms, and I found that really interesting. And of course, that does plant the political bug in somebody. And so let's be candid for a couple minutes, to the extent that anybody ever is when they're asked these kinds of speculative.
This is the candid conversation, right?
Yeah, when they ask these speculative conversations. So the governor's race in 2 years, I know the most common line of any elected official is, I haven't ruled it out. But is that something that you actually would look at seriously for the first time out of the gate for a high visibility office?
I can't say, because I don't have the luxury of thinking about an office that's a couple years from now or several years from now or next term.
Well, it's not very long before you have to get rolling if you're going to do it.
Well, that's for someone who sort of thinks about things in terms of politics. I think about things in terms of impact, and we have such an issue right now in this city that we're driving a lot of impact and change in this office, and it's kind of irresponsible, I think, for me or anyone else to take their eye off the ball of that. It's 100% of my focus. So when some of the stuff came out before and said, do you rule it out? The answer was, all I'm focused on is this.
And it would seem like, with your plate being as full as it is, that you could almost make not an ironclad commitment, but it sounds like you're certainly going to, the likelihood is you serve out the term and do all the things you've got going now. That's only a couple of years, and these things take time.
Yeah, the reality is I kind of can't see beyond the challenges we face as a city right now. And I will tell you, the timing of it is too important. The timing of where we are fiscally, the timing of where we are with our economy, and the timing where we are with the credibility of the people of Chicago is too important to think about anything else.
A lot of people view you as a future mayor, if that's a direction you choose to go in. Would you challenge Rahm in 19, or would you only consider a mayoral run if he isn't running?
Yeah, I think it's the same answer.
I mean, he's a friend, he's a mentor, he appointed you,
right.
But you wouldn't rule that out either.
It's the same answer as before. These are things I don't have the luxury to kind of pontificate about because we have an important job to do now, and thinking about who's going to be in what race is really of no concern to me.
But sooner or later, those decisions have to be made for people who want to. Now, I'm not talking about you being overly ambitious, but your ambition is to make a big difference.
Sure.
And some offices give you more tools with which to make that difference, and certainly mayors and governors have a few additional tools, although you've got a lot of them in the treasurer's office for the kinds of things you want to do. How does a timetable like that work? I know you mentioned fasting and praying with your wife before you decided to take the treasurer's job.
Look, it's true. I'm glad you asked about timetable. The saying, we make plans and God laughs, right? I'm living proof of that. And I didn't see this opportunity 2 years before it came, 3 years before it came. And if it was God's will for me to be here, it didn't matter who else was here, not here, et cetera. I think this is going to be the same thing, where I'm going to wake up every day and try to be led to be put to my highest and best use to serve God and to have the greatest amount of impact on the people that I'm here to serve and the city that I love.
And didn't you say one of these days you might actually start a family with your dear wife?
Yeah, that'd be ideal.
Let me just say, as a veteran of those wars, that does take a lot of time and energy.
Yeah, sure.
And you might have to take one thing off your to-do list or your plate to change diapers and all those other things, unless you're going to be like Bill Clinton and brag that you've never changed a diaper. I
No,
can't imagine.
Look, I changed. I'm the gap between me and my youngest sibling is 13 years, so I've already changed a fair share of diapers.
And are you finding, a final question, because I know we're just about out of time. You mentioned that you wake up every day absolutely, excited beyond belief to be the treasurer and have those treasurer's opportunities. I don't know that there are a lot of people in those kinds of jobs that make that kind of claim, but what's on your plate, I can see why you would. You're having a lot of fun at this?
I love it. I mean, I'm not a morning person. I'll admit that, and I jump out of bed in the morning. I love this work, and I am so fulfilled by it, and I see so much value and impact that we can have. It's a disservice to the people of Chicago that this office has been under the radar for as long as it has, because it could have been contributing and being a part of the solution. And so now we get to do that, and I think it's an honor.
And I'm just curious, so what's been more valuable in giving you guidance to doing what you're doing now, the MBA at Harvard or the experience of working for Michael and Pat?
None of the above. So the most impactful thing for me was when my grandfather passed away in 2005. He had started a business, and he left it to my mom. And my mom had been working in the company for 10 years and knew how to make the trains run on time. And she came to me and said, "Look, I know that I was leaving Goldman Sachs at the time where I was working to go help her." And she said, I need your help." And what I learned there was, I had to kind of grow up really fast and be a leader for my family and a leader in this business. And people relied on us to be able to feed their families. We had to figure out how to make payroll in a struggling business. We had to go give confidence to our customers and to our vendors, and we had to figure out how to financially work our way out of it. And that took a lot out of us. But what it built in me was a sense of responsibility, a sense of a greater purpose, and an understanding that if I can put the tools and gifts that God's given me to a greater use, it can help a lot of people.
And that was more valuable than working for captains of industry and finance.
Yeah, I mean, lots of times those folks don't have to think about whether or not someone is relying on them particularly to feed their family and having tough conversations.
And in the spirit of full disclosure, I will say with pride and happiness that both Michael and Pat are donors to the Better Government Association because they value the fight for better government, as I think you do too. Anyway, Kurt, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been a really good 45 minutes for people. Yeah, I agree. We don't have 10 cameras because this isn't like the Trump Tower. So you don't know we have an audience here, but we have about 50 people who came because they thought this would be an interesting conversation, and I think hopefully you've realized that there's a lot more than wonk value to the Treasurer's office. Thanks so much. I have a souvenir that everybody gets. This is our official Shining a Light on Government pen. I think I might have given you one when we had lunch a couple of years ago. Anyway, best of luck at this job, and I hope you can see the fruits of your labor in many of these things in the Treasurer's office and in whatever your future endeavors are. We'll keep a close eye. I don't think this is your last job. I just don't know what the next one is. And if you don't either, so we'll find out at the same time. Kurt Summer, City Treasurer, thanks a lot. Thank you all for watching. This has been one of our Bga Candid Conversations. We'll have another one as soon as we can convince someone to sit down and talk for a little bit. I'm Andy Shaw. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting us if you do. Please do if you haven't.